one of the realities we've had in the Caribbean for the last sort of 15, 20 years is that we've had a kind of securitization discourse. That means that security is the most important approach to crime and violence. But security approaches are reactive. They come after. That's not prevention. In the Caribbean, because we've had security for so long, prevention actually now falls under that umbrella. But what we've had to do is shift the culture of the conversation around security so that it now has prevention in it. And that doesn't happen overnight.
Welcome to Act Now Caribbean, 5 years forward. I'm Mikhail Cooper of the United Nations Information Center for the Caribbean area. In this series, we explore and reflect on conversations about Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm coming to you from UNIC's studio here in Trinidad, and joining me today is Dylan Kerrigan, Peace and Development Officer at the UN's Resident Coordinator's Office in Trinidad and Tobago. This episode presents us with an opportunity to learn about this role as well as its implementation in the Caribbean. We'll also aim to gain insight from Dylan on progress made as well as where there are opportunities to progress in the areas of violence prevention and building stronger institutions here in the Caribbean. Two factors that influence the way we experience and understand peace. Dylan, welcome.
Thank you, Mikhail.
So, Dylan, with our audience in mind, and for the sake of those who are not a part of the UN, what does the role of a Peace and Development Officer entail, and why is it necessary to have this role in the Caribbean?
Yeah, so I'm the Peace and Development Officer for the English and Dutch-speaking Caribbean, which is actually about 22 countries and territories in the Caribbean sub-region, all the way from Belize in the west to Trinidad and Tobago in the east. Essentially, in very basic terms, my job is about increasing or developing national and regional capacities for prevention. So that's a very kind of broad definition. Sometimes that could be entail thinking about data for prevention. Sometimes it can be about thinking about frameworks for prevention. Sometimes it's about building human relationships. Sometimes it's about shifting the culture a little bit. It's never one specific thing. It's a combination of various aspects. And in many ways, I work across all the different agencies that are here in the Caribbean. So in many ways, it's a very broad definition, which means that under the umbrella, you can do a lot of things. Sometimes I think of my role as a little bit as being a sticky glue with sort of rubber hands that kind of pulls lots of different agencies together to work on prevention as a kind of holistic UN endeavor, not least because obviously different agencies have different mandates, they work in different kind of silos sometimes, and it's very important that you have a sort of agent that can pull them together to focus them on the question of prevention.
Good. So there's also interventions in there as well?
Yeah, the interventions are important. So programs, interventions are important, but we kind of zoom out a little bit bigger. So we think about sort of how do you build more sort of a framework for prevention? How do you build an ecosystem, the enabling conditions for prevention? And that actually is a lot more than interventions on programs. That's not to say that, of course, programs aren't, extremely important and can be very well designed, but programs by themselves will not produce peace. They're just one element in a bigger kind of project of building and sort of developing peace.
Right. Okay, so there's that word peace, right? So it's easy to think of peace as the absence of war or physical conflict, right? And in regions like ours, conflict could look very different than it does on the international stage, but we're accustomed to seeing on the international stage. So in your experience, how do you define peace?
Great question. So of course I have the academic definition, sort of the absence of conflict, a space where development can proceed, unhindered by the dynamics that sort of are brought by things like crime and violence. I think it's a very interesting question to try to understand what peace is in the Caribbean. And it's actually something that I come up across quite a lot with colleagues outside of the Caribbean, because they automatically assume that we are a peaceful place of sun and beaches and tourism, but obviously we know it's a lot more complicated than that. So in many ways, we try to build peace in a variety of layered types. So we think about peace at the family, community level. We also have to think about peace within a kind of governance layer. But we also need to think about peace in sort of a national context, because peace actually in our zone isn't identical across all the different islands and nations. We might all want to have peaceful conditions and peace within our societies, but in order to achieve that, different countries are in different places in that kind of development. So peace, yes, absolutely a space where people can flourish, where they can develop, where they can become the best people that they want to be. But also understanding that peace is the absence of conflict. And within the Caribbean, what we have is a lot of community level sort of gangs, and we have other types of violence as well, which are a little bit unfortunate and running at high levels relatively. Maybe you can give us some examples of what conflict looks like here. Absolutely. So I'll start at the bottom-up level. One of the major areas that we think is quite important for intervening is at the family level. So unfortunately in the Caribbean, we do have quite high levels of IPV, also GBV. So that's kind of like domestic violence, interpersonal violence, which are very destabilizing, which kind of have knock-on effects for all members of the family and also impact the community. Due to the influx of weapons, like guns primarily and ammo from the global north, predominantly from markets in the United States, we also have a problem of lethality. So we have so many guns that where maybe disputes were dealt with bottles and punches previously, they're now dealt with guns, which obviously impacts the homicide rate very high. So on one level, the violence looks like community level feuds. Often those things, unfortunately, have become sort of disconnected from their origins. A lot of the initial sort of gangs were connected to transnational organized crime, drugs, guns would travel with the drugs. And that was the situation in Trinidad and Tobago for at least like the last 20 years. But things have shifted. The guns, the violence has moved away from being directly connected to transnational organized crime, while there's still a connection. But it also circulates socially and culturally, connected to things like turf, connected to things like masculinities, connected to things like corruption too. So our violence in that sense is predominantly around homicides, but there's also a big layer about crime and violence, and also sort of interpersonal violence and that kind of violence that can happen in the family for a variety of reasons.
Right. And I mean, from what I'm hearing, I'm also understanding that there are many areas of interconnectedness in all these different aspects that you've highlighted.
Yeah. So it's not so simple to say everything's connected, but it is kind of in that genre, because what we're really thinking about in the Caribbean is a systems approach to violence. So that problems that maybe starting at the family level can sort of cascade through the system, through a kind of youth vulnerability, into being sort of exposed to sort of gang influence, to actually being involved in that, to that kind of creating problems in terms of, job employment or health costs or policing costs. And those things affect the economy, and then they feed back into the system. So it's a system of cascading layers and loops that feed back into each other. So trying to just deal with violence through a program can't really deal with violence. It's systemic. So you have to think about how do you influence the system? How do you break certain feedback loops that kind of reinforce the system? And that's kind of where we go now as the UN in terms of thinking about prevention, trying to be a bit more sophisticated, seeing it as not just an economic thing, but a social thing, a cultural thing, and having multiple layers. So we really think about a layered approach to crime and violence that, moves into the zone of thinking about how does violence function as a system, and what would you do to sort of impact that system.
So we also have that idea about strengthening institutions, right? So my question in relation to that is, what are we referring to when we use the term institutions?
Yeah,
give us a breakdown of...
That's a great question. Institutions, I have a background in academia before I did this, so I would talk about institutions for the family as an institution, religion as an institution. But really when we're talking about that, we're talking about the institutions of governance. For the UN, we're really talking about those sorts of level institutions. And it's very important to think about how the population responds to institutions, right? So unfortunately, if you look at the voter turnout data for 2025, where we had 12 elections in the Caribbean region, most of those elections saw a decline in voting, right? So that's obviously a signal that maybe people don't necessarily feel that the governance institutions are delivering, right? We also have data from something called the Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Index, which was a 7-country study in the Caribbean, which talked about trust in institutions. And unfortunately, that suggested that trust is very low in institutions. And people aren't necessarily feeling like their institutions are delivering. What happens is they pull away from those institutions. That doesn't mean that they're still not interested in fixing their communities. What it really means is that nationally they feel they can't affect things, so they retreat to their communities. So they'll be more involved in trying to fix the community themselves than they would be in voting. So it's very important to increase the trust that populations in the Caribbean have with their institutions, because they're almost like the first port of call for how governance can start to tackle crime and violence and build prevention. And if people don't trust their institutions, they're not likely to turn to those to report crime, to say what they think's happening, to work with the authorities, to even when we go into the community, be interested in the programming, right? If they feel like, oh, it's just another program, you've done this crime, it's still awful. So you have to think about it like that. Okay. It's really about trust.
Give me some examples of institutions.
So I would think, the rule of law institutions, the democratic institutions, we sort of break things into different kind of aspects of the society. I think, education, health systems. You're really thinking about the whole kind of breadth of the different levers that a government has in order to impact and shape its society. So I would say that all of those things that are involved in governance, and sometimes prevention, people might think, well, is that about governance? Maybe there's crime and violence, but, prevention is obviously part of a governance framework. So if you're not building the sort of architecture or the economic or the ecosystem for prevention, then you're not really kind of using those institutions in their full capacity. You're missing part of the equation. So yeah, institutions totally very important. Yeah.
Understood. Okay. So I'm going to take us back into trust in institutions. In societies like ours, what happens when trust erodes in institutions?
Yeah, so we deal with this a lot. I think, as human beings, it's important to think about trust as almost like a sort of glue that holds us together, makes us closer, that increases social cohesion. So where trust is lacking, you'll often see people speaking negatively about their institutions. As I said, they'll remove themselves from taking part in democratic kind of governance, voting. It can also happen at the more youth level, right? You can have young people thinking that the schools aren't delivering for them, or thinking about prestige school system, and so they pull away from that institution. When I've done work in communities with young people who are like 14, 15, they often tell me, I gave up on that school because I know that the better kids are going to the best school, and they just want me to have this kind of life, so I don't go to school anymore. And, education is a resilience factor. I was talking about, prevention, and one of the things we need to do is understand the risks for people to falling into things like crime and violence. But we also need to build up people's resilience to when bad things happen, that they don't fall into those things. And education, no matter which way you cut it, is a huge resilience factor. It's an even bigger resilience factor where you have support from your parents in helping you with the school. So there's a relationship between schools, parenting, and resilience. And if any of those is broken, it can often impact the young people. And one of the things that we often think about is when negative things happen to young people, you're shaping them, right? And that can have a knock-on effect for their life chances. So it's really important not just to work with in a reactive way with people who are in their 20s and 30s, although that's important. But you really have to also work with children, and also that kind of secondary level where they're more like teenagers, because as one young person told me once who I did this work with, it's much easier to sort of bend back a small growing tree than it is to change a huge big oak or something like that.
A full-grown one.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, and you could let me know if I'm on the right track, is that trust in institutions and the way how we see these institutions can affect the way we also see ourselves and where we see ourselves. And for example, you use like youth and education.
Yeah, so an interesting thing that we all like, one of the things that shapes our society in Trinidad and Tobago is perception, like fear of crime, right? And so when we're talking about trust, all these things, it can filter into other things like how you perceive what might happen to you, whether or not that's connected to the actual data. So fear is also part of the bigger, conundrum. So you're not just dealing with economic things or social things or cultural things. You're also dealing with individual human beings' emotional sense of how they feel in certain spaces. A lot of people in Trinidad and Tobago often say they don't go out to do their walking around the savannah anymore. That
Right.
Our data suggests to us that old people and young people are not mixing in the same communal spaces anymore. When that happens, you're having a fracture because old people and young people have a relationship that's really central to society being a kind of cohesive thing. So yeah, it's a big dilemma, and trust is almost like the entry point for what we need to work on. So it's important to sort of reinforce that as best you can. And what is often missing, I think, and obviously in my personal opinion, in governance is constant sensitization, right? If you want to really keep populations with you want to carry them on the journey from a violent society to a peaceful one, you need to keep them informed regularly about what you're doing, how it impacts them, how it's going to change their lives, what results are coming out. And that's not really how, not to be too negative, that's not necessarily how the governance systems work, So that's a kind of missing component to that kind of constant sensitization, because that will help you to build back trust.
Right, understood. So you would have touched on a little bit of this, and I'd ask you to go a little further here. What are some of the early warning signs that a society is moving in an unhealthy direction?
So in the Caribbean, I would say that's actually, something we shot past a long time ago, right? Early warning signs. We really have had a problem with guns in our society since the late 1990s. That's what the data says. We went through a period of relatively low, manageable crime and violence, slight increases from the 70s during the 80s and 90s, but there's an explosion at the end of the 90s through the noughties into where we are now. But to go back to your question, you'll start to see some of the dynamics I've been talking about, maybe increases in sort of people not reporting sort of crimes, increases in people pulling away from government services, increases in communities kind of taking things into their own hands. That can both be progressive and negative, because sometimes that leaves a space for gang kind of governance to start kind of coming in. They might pay for people to go to school or have their school books, feed them, which kind of creates another dynamic. And then, if there's a gap there that, the state can't move into or chooses not to move into, homicide rates grow, of course, GBV rates grow. So there's lots of kind of warning signs for when societies are shifting. Unfortunately, in many of our Caribbean societies, we have had high homicide rates now for more than a decade. Things are shifting in some of them. In 2025, a lot of countries actually showed a reduction in the homicide count compared to 2024. So that's a sign of something shifting. Right. Some kind of middled and kind of stayed around the same, but some countries actually dropped quite a lot. And I think that's something we need to hold on to and try to figure out a little bit more and sort of try to support moving forward.
Now, a number of those things you listed, those early warning signs, they seem familiar, and rightfully so, because as you've highlighted, we've been going in certain directions for over a few decades now, and there is change that's taken place. So where would you identify as some of the areas that we have been making meaningful progress, and we can expand this to the region, within the region of the Caribbean? Where have we been making meaningful progress, and also where are some of the areas you can identify that have gaps and still need some work?
It's a great question. And the UN is really in this space at the moment. As someone who works in prevention, there's always this kind of sort of not metaphor but analogy that prevention windows don't stay open for long. They'll close. Some kind of geopolitical thing or national thing will come, and you lose your opportunity to build prevention. Over the last few years, we have had some opportunities here to build prevention. They've been, firstly through entry points. We've had a lot of mandates from CARICOM about the public health approach, the Need and Points Declaration, certain mandates for government. When governments are calling for prevention, that's an entry point, right? If the governments aren't asking the UN to do that, we can't really shift gears. Right. Alongside the governments asking us, CARICOM is asking us. They're asking us to think about how we can, help to support prevention in terms of building the ecosystem, building the enabling conditions. One of the big negatives that we've had in the Caribbean, and maybe I shouldn't describe it as a negative, one of the realities we've had in the Caribbean for the last sort of 15, 20 years is that we've had what I would call this kind of standard academic speak, a kind of securitization discourse. That means that security is the most important approach to crime and violence. But security approaches are reactive. They come after. That's not prevention. In the Caribbean, because we've had security for so long, prevention actually now falls under that umbrella. But what we've had to do is shift the culture of the conversation around security so that it now has prevention in it. And that doesn't happen overnight. That's happened through a lot of different spaces. Because security has had a lot of money pumped into it, and that's the way we've dealt with a lot of these problems, you've kind of got to move in a way that brings those people with you, because if you suddenly leave them out, you're going to not have access to the resources. So we've worked really hard to shift the culture around security professionals so that now they ask for and demand prevention. So the UN and through UN LIREC developed something called the Caribbean Firearms Roadmap. This is a great initiative because it was all about heads of police, ministries of security, militaries, all kind of coming together across the region. This includes other countries outside like DR and a few of the Spanish-speaking countries, to talk about how that they can now have a prevention addendum within their roadmaps. And that's allowed us to also start to build what we think is a kind of UN framework for action, which opens up spaces to talk with different countries about prevention. And just one extra part of the answer is the region has what we would understand as workers in this space, a regional risk profile. Within that regional risk profile, all the countries sit, but each country is nationally divergent. So you can't dump down one blueprint for prevention across the region that will work. You can drop down a regional risk picture, but within that, you need to develop nationally divergent, a kind of principle that will allow nationally divergent realities to come to the top, so each country can build it in the way that's most sensible for their own needs.
So I'd like to bring young people into the focus now. So when young people feel disconnected or excluded from the decision-making process, how does that impact regional stability and peace?
It's a great question. You can't have peace without the young people included. It's just basic, right? But it's important. And I think governance understands that now. I think, for example, the Trinidad and Tobago context, we now have a government that's interested in developing a multi-sectoral approach to the prevention of youth violence, to preventing youth crime and violence. You can't do that if you're not going out and talking to the young people. In the UNDP here in Trinidad and Tobago, we did a really interesting project called the Up for Hustlers, where we actually went into more of a work with lots of young people to kind of understand their experiences, hear it firsthand, get a kind of bottom-up lens at the picture of power and how they feel and experience it. Because without those voices, you're just kind of like going into places and telling people what to do. If you're not including people in the decision-making, sensitizing them, making them voices, they're not going to do it. It goes back to the trust thing. They'll be like, they might do it for you because they like you as an individual. But once you leave the situation, they won't continue like that. So we try very hard right now to have a lot of youth voices. We set up a lot of things. The UNDP, we have this fantastic youth forum now that's kind of taken from across Trinidad and Tobago, and we use them for a lot of soundboarding our ideas, getting them to feedback what would work better. Likewise, when I do this work up the islands, because of course I'm regional, I embed and I talk to young people from a lot of young organizations, and I'm very good at just giving you my contact details and saying, hey, reach out to me, tell me what you're thinking. And I find that really helps me to do this work, because then I include the young people, go back to them, try to think about co-creating with them. So yeah, without those voices, you miss things. They understand the world. Like, I'm older now. I can't tell you what the young people are going through, right? If I don't include them, I'm kind of making it up. So it's a very important context. Very important context, yeah.
Okay, so it presents opportunities for reflection, as well as increasing that trust in the institutions that we want them to believe in.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Understood. So let's use our imaginations here.
Okay, cool.
Right? So let's imagine that we're in 2030 and we're able to say that the Caribbean has established a more peaceful, a more cohesive and resilient outlook. What would our most significant achievements have been that would have allowed us to get there?
Great question. I'm happy to be in 2030 looking at a more peaceful Caribbean. Yeah, this is what we've been working for. No, I think that's a great question. So in many ways, I think you could take that in a layered approach, right? So I would say, let's go from the top rather than the bottom this time. At the top, governance would be kind of reflecting this kind of prevention architecture I explained. You'd have better enabling conditions. There'd be political leadership in this regard. There would be data that we could use to know what's really happening at granular level. There'd be like coordination across different aspects of the government. There'd be like a budget line. There'd be like policy. They'd be investing in it. The prevention case, the investment case for prevention would have been made. So people start to realize, well, if we spend money on prevention, we actually get more money for education and health and that kind of stuff. So you'd have on that level this kind of enabling conditions and prevention architecture and governments. And also there'll become sort of regional catalysts of that and abilities to learn from each other. Well, we did this in St. Kitts, we did this in Trinidad. Well, why don't you try this in Jamaica? Oh, we did this in Jamaica and it works. So people sharing, funders providing money that shared so people could do this. And then when you taper down to sort of the community level, there'd be less crime and violence. There would be less kind of IPV. There would be less violence against children, less violence against women and girls. We'd have found ways to sort of dilute that. 2030 is only 4 years away, so I don't think we can necessarily say that we'd have had a generational change by then. But maybe we would have done enough things to, reinforce these resilience factors I was talking about, having people with a bit more open-minded to sort of gender equality, having people who are a bit more tolerant of other groups, having people who maybe feel that there's jobs for them because they're not so scared to go out into the population. Maybe even, people feeling like they have a bit more faith in the system, that they want to vote more regularly because they want to say, well, this is working, I want to be part of it. So I think the opportunities are there. And, I think by 2030 we can have shifts, but maybe the shift will be slightly longer than 2030. But I'm hopeful that we're moving that direction because, that's what people want. People are asking for peace. And some of the conditions that make our situation so lethal are actually beyond the control of individual members of the society or the government, because we're talking about bigger countries with bigger markets that, for example, with the guns, filter down to us. Take the guns out of the equation, we have a much more peaceful society immediately. But that is so difficult to do right now.
Understood. You paint a really great picture of 2030, if only, but I'm sure it can act as a roadmap to getting us to where we want to be. In the areas of violence prevention and building stronger institutions, if you were, I know you said that it's bigger than the individual, but if you were to assign us rules as individuals, aimed at reinforcing these goals of violence prevention and strengthening institutions, what would those rules be for us as individuals?
Yeah. So again, I think it would depend a little bit on the role you play in society as well as your sort of individual role. But on a basic level, emotional sort of qualities level, I think empathy for each other, understanding or at least thinking about what it's like to stand in somebody else's shoes. I think the gender equality part I suggested is important. When you look at the data, unfortunately, there's a big correlation between people who believe in gender stereotypes about men are this, women are that, and sort of correlations with people who develop attitudes towards violence and using violence. So we live in a society that's heavily dominated by sort of social norms around masculinity and patriarchy. So we need to shift that a little bit. That's very important for the region. I mentioned tolerance. Like social tolerance is actually something that's actually built into many Caribbean people, especially in Trinidad and Tobago. Like diversity is our strength. We're more likely to mix with others, share on festivals and stuff. And that kind of diversity and social glue, that cohesion between people is also essential for building peace. If I step out of the individuals and think about people who have roles within society, I think we need leaders who understand the topic of violence prevention. I think a lot of leaders don't necessarily have backgrounds in the prevention of violence, and they're thrown into situations where they get in as a high crime rate. So the first thing they come up with is security plan, right? Which you can understand, but maybe if you think about the PM of St. Kitts and Nevis, who is PM Terence True, he's a medical doctor. His approach to violence prevention comes from his background as a medical doctor. So it's slightly different from somebody who's coming at it as a lawyer. So I also think that the background of the leaders is an ingredient that people sort of forget sometimes. And then I think in terms of like people who function in sort of education, in governance institutions, in the public sector, they have to be a bit more mindful to sort of what's described as the public health approach to crime and violence, right? Because public health approach is no way to talk about prevention, you know? Really, we're all living in a society together. So public health is everybody's, you know, health. So a public health approach, and this is something led by PAHO that do fantastic work in this area, really start to see health systems as prevention. But then that feeds into other things, justice reform as prevention, data collection as prevention. Suddenly all these things can become about prevention. Rather than strictly thinking about how do we use them in a kind of reactive security sense. So in some ways, I feel like it's, without, you know, belittling anybody or anything, so it's almost like a bit more sophisticated understanding of what prevention is as a systemic approach to the problem of crime and violence, I think could shift not just people at the community level, but those people at the top level, and also all of us who will do the work in the institutions too.
So you touched on, to the end of your response, sophisticated understanding. Now, something that caught me off guard was how simple your answer was, as a matter of fact. You know, because you spoke about empathy, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, tolerance, mindfulness. I would not have even considered that.
It's interesting you say that. So when you go and ask these questions to the young people, those are the kinds of things they would say, you know. They would add in a few more things and say, you know, trust us to be leaders, include us in the leadership conversation. One of the things I've also noticed in communities where we've done research is, in general, leadership seems to be something that's diluted. People aren't stepping up at a community level to be leaders of the community. And the people that are, in our data, is more women than men, right? So you have this kind of shift almost that women are the ones who are standing up to be counted as leaders in the community. But then those same women will say that they're not being included. Their voices are not kind of heard in the same way that if a man is in that space as well. So, you know, I don't want to go back to something that sounds so basic, but I think gender is a huge reason that we may be not exactly where we want to be, like understanding gender in our kind of traditional historical ways that have been handed down to us and that we all kind of fall into in terms of our jokes and how we talk with each other or when we lime or whatever. But unfortunately, if we don't fix that and have a sort of broader gender equality mindset, we kind of get stuck in a hole that's hard to climb out of. Not to forget that obviously women are half the society too. So if we're not using them in the same way for ideas and development, we're missing half of the answers to the questions, right? So yeah, so you've got to kind of think about shifting it a little way. And I do think it's simple. I do think it's simple. And sometimes things get lost in the jargon and the realities of the day-to-day life. But, you know, caring about people, being open to understanding difference. Like, I think sometimes, for whatever reason, people's differences are seen as negative. And I actually think the one thing that makes us all human is we're different from each other. So those differences, there's no other Mikhail or another Dylan, right? So it's those differences that make us human. And those are the things that we need to sort of protect and herald and say they're good things. So also, I think open up to the power of our differences might actually be a way to help us solve the problem too.
Understood. So just to wrap, you touched on gender. We have women, they're partaking, but they don't feel heard. And then we also have men, where we see in the participation, it's falling off. And I'm assuming that ties into trust in institutions, as well as how men engage with each other and maybe even see themselves. Tell us or remind us, what's the UN doing to support these initiatives and get that inclusion up?
So a really interesting one is UN Women, and there was something that they call Women, Peace and Security. About a year, 2 years ago, working with the government of Trinidad and Tobago, UN Women, I was part of the project too, developed a Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. And what's quite interesting about this, if we go back to what I said at the beginning, is that we kind of live in a region where security and securitization has really been the dominant way that people think about dealing with crime and violence. One of the things that you kind of do, remember I was saying you had to shift the culture of these security actors, is by doing something like a WPS NAP, a Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan, you're sort of pulling expert women into the security space But by doing that, you're opening up that security space to include other dynamics. So, for example, in this WPS NAP, it had a big section on social norms and shifting the social norms and how you could potentially use women leaders within different institutions, including the security service and the armed forces, to help in that shift. So that's one big way that I think is doing it. I think in general as well, sort of gender sensitization is always really important. I think a lot of us, we fall into, as you said, when you're having with your buddies and hanging out, we kind of fall into forms of speech and sort of discourse that if women were in that space, they would be like, well, that's really problematic language, that's really violent language. And also, it's not to say that women aren't shaped by those same problematic social norms too and have certain language and expectations. Oh, well, men should be like this. Remember, so it is something difficult to shift. And the historians amongst us would say it's not just something that happened in the last 20 years. This is coming from like hundreds, from the 19th century forward, from the 1800s forward. So it's a constant battle. But, if you look at the young people today, like those under 20-year-olds, they're already shifting. Their conversations are slightly different about gender than our conversations about gender. They're more open-minded to women being leaders. They've seen it now. It's normal. So I do think the young people, and it's such a cliche, they're the future, they're the ones that are going to save us. And so there's a lot of load to put on them. But I do feel like that generation, this one coming through, are more open-minded to difference. They're more tolerant. They have a bigger gender equality mindset. They realize the job market's a bit problem, so they're not all kind of dependent on the state saying it's going to fix things. So they realize they have to fix things. So it's almost like the environment will shape the people in it and the cultures they produce. So if you're living in an environment that's very, a lot of down pressure and, a lack of jobs, you feel no one's listening to you, what are you going to do? Well, human beings come up with new culture to solve those problems. And I think it's already happening with the young people I meet and that I speak to through this job. So that's just one part of the puzzle. Obviously, there's lots of different moving bits for this bigger issue of the prevention of violence. But I do think that young people and the shifts that we're seeing amongst these young people will be part of this better 2030 and hopeful for, an even better future.
Going forward.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, Dylan, thank you for the insight and making the time to be with us here today.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks for the conversation. I would love to you do it again. No problem.
We should. And thank you for joining us. This podcast is produced by the United Nations Information Center for the Caribbean area, the voice and the face of the United Nations in the Caribbean. For more content in this series, find and follow the UNIC's Build Back Better podcast on our website and Spotify.